The movie opens with a young guy named Paul celebrating his bachelor party with a couple of friends at a crowded bar. Engaged to his boss's daughter, Paul is ecstatic about his upcoming wedding and enjoys bachelorhood with his friends for the very last time. He and his friends take shots, one after the other. During this, Paul's best friend even proposes a toast, wishing him and his fiancée Karen a happy married life. As the party continues, Paul's brother Pete approaches him and asks him to loosen up a little. Pete then starts venting about his own broken marriage, exclaiming that it was absolutely miserable. After a lot of complaining about his ex-wife, Pete assures Paul that his marriage will definitely be successful since Karen is a witty, beautiful, and kind woman. Paul simply smiles at that and thanks his brother for the warm wishes. Moments later, Paul approaches his friend Jim and informs him that he doesn't want to entertain any girls at his bachelor party. Wanting to be loyal to his fiancée, he asks Jim to go on his behalf and have as much fun as he wants. Jim readily agrees and instantly starts flirting with all the girls there. Just then, a group of tiki girls walk into the bar and begin dancing. They congratulate Paul on his upcoming wedding and try their best to entertain him. Paul, however, isn't interested in them at all, but among them, a beautiful blonde girl catches his eye. He and the girl steal glances at each other every so often and start to get closer. Eventually, the two meet up at the bar and introduce themselves. The girl, whose name happens to be Becky, mentions that it's her first day dancing at a bachelor party, so she doesn't really know what she's doing. Paul smiles at that and offers to buy her a beer. Becky happily agrees, and the two start drinking and getting to know each other. As expected, Paul gets wasted a couple of hours later and passes out. He wakes up the next morning in his apartment, but, much to his surprise, he sees Becky sleeping right next to him. Now terrified, he immediately jumps out of bed. Not knowing what to do, he starts running around the room in a panicked state. Right at that moment, he gets a call from his mother-in-law, Sandra, who informs him that Karen is on her way to the apartment. Needless to say, Paul immediately hangs up the call and wakes Becky up. He then asks her to leave since his fiancée might be coming over. Hearing this, Becky runs out of the bedroom with nothing but a bedsheet covering her. She starts searching for all her stuff while Paul gets busy cleaning up his apartment, praying to God that Karen doesn't find anything suspicious. After a while, Becky gets dressed and runs out of the apartment. But before she leaves, she asks Paul not to panic so much since that would definitely make matters worse. Paul agrees and ushers her out of the place as fast as possible. Immediately after she leaves, Karen arrives at the apartment. Paul hurriedly hides anything that might be related to Becky and opens the door. An oblivious Karen simply walks in, kisses Paul, and asks him how his party was. He replies that it went great and tries his best not to stress too much. After a brief conversation, Karen hands Paul a bunch of outfits to wear at the upcoming events since they're getting married in a week. The two then sit down on the couch and start talking about the rehearsal dinner and wedding arrangements. Just then, Paul notices a flower that belonged to Becky. While trying not to panic, he sneakily hides it under the pretense of kissing Karen. Soon after, Karen leaves the apartment as she's busy with wedding preparations. Meanwhile, Paul quickly gets ready and rushes out as well. He drives straight to Jim's apartment and starts banging on the door. When Jim opens up, Paul hurls one question after another at him. Since he doesn't remember anything about last night, he asks Jim what had happened. In response, Jim simply shrugs and says that he was wasted too. He then urges Paul to forget whatever happened and consider himself lucky since he got to make love to a gorgeous girl like Becky. However, Paul feels extremely guilty about it and plans on telling Karen the truth. But Jim immediately stops him. Now concerned, he tells Paul that if Karen finds out, the wedding will be called off and his life will be in shambles. Instead, he assures Paul that such things are pretty common at bachelor parties and nothing to worry about. Eventually, after a long time of thinking, Paul decides it's best to keep this all a secret. Since he wouldn't ever see Becky again, she wouldn't be a problem in his relationship. Later that day, Paul gets dressed and heads to work, assuming his life will return to normal. But to his dismay, he encounters Becky again, working as a toll booth collector. Surprised, he asks what happened to her dance group. Becky replies that she got fired and is now forced to work at the toll booth. Not wanting to make things awkward, Paul simply nods and tries to drive away. However, Becky accidentally dents the hood of his car. She apologizes profusely and urges him to forget whatever happened between them. Moments later, Paul, now practically traumatized by Becky's behavior, goes to his office and heads directly to his boss's office. He greets his boss, Ken, who also happens to be Karen's father, cheerfully. In turn, Ken smiles and asks how his bachelor party was. A very nervous Paul replies that it was pretty uneventful and boring. The two then chat about business for a while before heading to a meeting together. During the meeting, Paul starts to feel really itchy in his crotch. Trying to be inconspicuous, he scratches the area discreetly. Just then, Ken, unaware of Paul's discomfort, asks him to give a presentation on their new business venture. Paul hesitantly gets up and starts presenting his idea to the audience. Soon enough, his nether regions start itching again, so he hurriedly runs to the restroom. There, he discovers he has crabs, a sexually transmitted disease that causes intense itching. Paul quickly goes to the nearest department store to buy medication. He walks up to the cashier and quietly asks about crab medicine. However, the cashier doesn't realize Paul's request is private and starts looking for the medication loudly. Embarrassed that the entire store now knows about his condition, Paul buys the medicine and tries to leave quickly. Unfortunately, he bumps into Sandra, his mother-in-law. Now incredibly nervous, he distracts her with a brief conversation before rushing out of the store. That evening, Paul, along with his parents, goes to Karen's house for dinner. There, Paul kisses Karen passionately and spends some quality time with her. The two then head to the kitchen to meet Karen's great-aunt Budge. However, when Paul looks into the kitchen, he sees none other than Becky chatting with an elderly woman. It turns out she's actually Karen's cousin. Now petrified, Paul runs out of the room. Meanwhile, Karen approaches Becky and hugs her tightly. The two chat for a while and even discuss Becky's ex-boyfriend Ray, who had apparently cheated on her with multiple women. Moments later, Karen looks around for Paul, but can't seem to find him anywhere. Finally, after a couple of minutes, she finds him hiding under a pile of clothes in one of the bedrooms. Confused, she asks him what he's doing, to which he replies that he just wanted to take a nap. Karen finds this really weird, but decides to brush it off. She then tries to introduce him to Aunt Budge again. Not wanting to expose himself, Paul pretends to have a stomachache and runs to the bathroom. He locks himself inside and starts acting as though he has diarrhea. Sometime later, everyone in the house gathers around to have dinner. When Paul realizes that Becky is in the room with Karen, he starts to freak out. With no other choice, he jumps out of the bathroom window and hangs from a tree. He slowly climbs down and lands on Ken's car. This sets off the car alarm, causing Ken and Paul's stepfather, Buck, to run out of the house. The two rush outside, check the car, and look around for the potential culprit. Thankfully, Paul manages to hide just in time. Realizing his misfortune, he climbs back up the tree and re-enters the bathroom. However, he gets a little hurt in the process and groans in pain. Karen, who is waiting just outside, thinks he's really sick and starts to worry. Soon after, the entire family gathers outside the bathroom door to check on Paul. Thankfully, Paul assures them that he's getting a little better and asks them all to give him a little privacy. Soon after, all the guests leave, including Paul's parents and Becky. Realizing this, Paul exits the bathroom and informs Karen that he's feeling much better. The two then walk down the stairs while talking about everything Paul apparently missed at dinner. Suddenly, the main door slams open, and Becky walks in, claiming she left her purse inside. This time, Paul can't hide and is forced to meet Becky. He tries his best not to show any emotions and greets her as though they're meeting for the first time. When Becky looks at Paul, she's taken aback. Despite her initial shock, she greets him awkwardly and quickly runs out of the place. After she leaves, Karen informs Paul that Becky has been really unstable since her breakup. She explains that Ray, her ex, was a psychopath who constantly cheated on her. Karen further adds that Ray works as a police officer and often abuses his authority to torture weaker people. Upon hearing this, Paul feels a little nervous, but doesn't dwell much on it. The next day, Paul and Pete go to a boutique to buy suits for the wedding. While trying on different outfits, Paul confesses to his brother that he somehow ended up cheating on Karen with her cousin. As expected, Pete is shocked and angrily asks why he would do something so awful. It's evident that Pete is madly in love with Karen, but is staying silent because she's his brother's fiancée. Moving forward, Pete scolds Paul for his reckless behavior and goes on about how Karen is too beautiful and perfect to deserve this. Eventually, Paul gets tired of Pete showering Karen with compliments, so he quickly changes the subject. Trying to be hopeful, he tells his brother that Becky didn't react badly and will probably never bring up their one-night stand. But then, Pete chimes in, saying that Becky will eventually blurt out the truth one day. He warns that the moment she gets drunk, she'll tell Karen everything. This causes Paul to panic, so he runs to a nearby record store where Becky apparently works. It's no surprise that she got fired from her toll booth job as well. As Paul enters the store, he runs into Becky, who surprisingly doesn't react upon seeing him. Instead, she casually chats with him for quite a while. But when he brings up their recent one-night stand, Becky suddenly blows up at him for practically kicking her out of his apartment after they spent the night together, and for hiding the fact that he's marrying her cousin. Paul immediately apologizes for his behavior and promises never to do such a thing again. That's when Becky reveals that they didn't actually sleep together. It turns out that Becky did go to his apartment, but by that time, he had already passed out. Upon hearing this, Paul feels greatly relieved, but also confused. Distressed, he tells Becky that he has crabs and assumes it is because she had given them to him. In response, Becky simply rolls her eyes and says he probably got the disease from a toilet seat. Paul then recalls the night of the bachelor party and thinks of a very itchy man who had hugged him. He quickly puts two and two together and realizes that he got crabs from the man who had hugged him too tightly. After clearing up the confusion, Paul requests Becky never tell Karen anything about what happened at the bachelor party. Thankfully, Becky agrees, claiming that she wouldn't ruin anybody's relationship. Paul thanks her for her compliance and then walks out of the record store. That night, Paul hurriedly rushes to a dance studio after being terribly late due to a broken clock. There, he meets with Karen and profusely apologizes to her. The two then practice for their wedding dance, but end up failing miserably. Eventually, after a long while, the two succeed. Amidst all this, Karen slowly starts to think that she made the wrong choice and feels as though she should back out of the wedding. While driving back home, Karen asks Paul if he booked the string quartet for their wedding. Paul replies that he hasn't since he wants to have a band instead. This answer angers Karen and she gives him a serious glare. It's evident that the two have completely different choices in everything. Moving forward, Karen drops Paul off at his apartment and drives away. Just as Paul is about to enter the complex, an infuriated Ray storms up to him and punches the air out of his lungs. He then grabs Paul by the collar and curses him for sleeping with Becky. Paul tries to clarify the situation, but that's when Ray pulls out a bunch of photos of him and Becky in the same bed. It turns out that Ray had actually hired a private investigator to follow Becky and snap her pictures. Ray threatens Paul by saying that he made the biggest mistake of his life, and even goes as far as to throw all sorts of food at him. Finally, after horrendously abusing Paul, Ray throws him inside a dumpster bin with all the pictures and walks away. In the meantime, Karen, who had sensed that something was wrong, drives back to Paul's apartment and notices all his groceries lying on the ground. She then hears his groans coming out of a dumpster bin and instantly runs up to him. Now concerned, she helps him get out of the bin and gets him inside the apartment. When asked what happened, Paul simply replies that he was mugged and makes up an elaborate story of a tall guy attacking him. Shortly after the two leave, a chubby little boy opens the trash can and grabs all the pictures of Becky and Paul in a compromising position. Back at the apartment, Karen calls the cops and asks Paul to give a description of the man who attacked him. Paul, not wanting Karen to find out the truth, gives a false description and makes up a story in front of the officers. The cops quickly grow suspicious and doubt that he's telling the truth. They try to question him further, but Karen stops them and ushers them outside. She then helps Paul into bed and goes to get him some aspirin. In the process, however, Karen finds Becky's underwear hidden inside the toilet tank. Furious, she confronts Paul about it. He tries to explain by claiming he planned to gift them to her, but Karen doesn't believe him and accuses him of bringing another girl into his apartment. Now incredibly nervous, Paul scrambles to make one excuse after another. Karen then points out that the underwear is dirty. Paul, grasping at straws, insists that the store sold him dirty underwear. Still unconvinced, Karen urges Paul to tell her the truth, but he stubbornly sticks to his story. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Karen decides to call the store from where Paul supposedly bought the underwear. Paul tries to stop her, but she ignores him. Moments later, a cashier picks up the call and asks how he may help her. In response, Karen asks the cashier as to why they have dirty underwear lying around in the store. The cashier quickly realizes the issue and ends up lying, claiming that a couple of college kids pranked them by placing dirty underwear in their store. He then apologizes on behalf of the store and even asks them to come by for a refund. As expected, Karen finally believes Paul and feels incredibly guilty. While sobbing, she insists that she's a terrible person and profusely apologizes for doubting him. Paul quickly reassures her, telling her it's okay and asking her to lighten up. Just as the situation starts to improve, there's a knock on the door. Paul opens it to find none other than his neighbor, Mr. Ferris, standing before him with a bunch of pictures in his hand. It turns out that the boy who stole Paul and Becky's photos from the trash can is Mr. Ferris's son. Furious, Mr. Ferris accuses Paul of corrupting his son with pornography. When Karen hears the commotion at the door, she gets up and moves to join Paul. In a panic, Paul quickly grabs the pictures from his neighbor's hand and shoves them down his pants. He somehow manages to calm the situation down and drags Karen back into the apartment. Once inside, Paul rushes into the bathroom and tries to burn the pictures. He then throws them out the window, only for Mr. Ferris's son to pick them up again. Just minutes after burning the pictures, Mr. Ferris knocks on Paul's door once again and confronts him with a bunch of half-burnt photos. Needless to say, Paul apologizes once again and runs back inside. At that moment, he gets a call from Becky, who informs him that Ray still has multiple pictures of them together. She then states that since Ray is a psycho, he'll probably use the photos to blackmail them. To avoid this, Becky suggests they sneak into his apartment at night and get all the negatives. Paul readily agrees with this and prepares to leave for the night. Moments later, he picks Becky up, and soon, the two drive towards Ray's apartment. They quickly sneak into the flat and start looking around for their photos. But just when Becky finds them, Paul drops a statue and causes a loud crash. This wakes up Ray's dog, who begins chasing them both around the house. With no other choice, Becky and Paul hide in the bathtub. They then wait for the dog to walk away, but end up failing miserably, so they just sit down in the tub and start talking about their lives. After a while of conversing, Becky comes up with a solid plan. She lures the dog inside the tub and jumps out just in time to trap it. Paul and Becky then run out of the apartment as fast as they can. While heading back home, the two get to know each other better and realize they have a lot of similar interests. They enjoy each other's company and joke around cheerfully. Eventually, Paul drops Becky off at her place and bids her goodbye. He then proceeds to return to his apartment, but that's when Ray spots him. The angered cop follows Paul and arrests him for substance possession, though Ray himself planted the substances in Paul's car. At the police station, a couple of other officers take Paul into an isolated room and threaten him, demanding the truth. Paul clarifies that he has been framed and begins telling the entire story of why Ray hates him. Just as he's about to finish his long rant, the internal affairs team walks in and asks Paul to wear a wire to help them keep an eye on Ray and his activities. It turns out they've been tracking Ray to expose his corrupt behavior. Despite his initial hesitation, Paul agrees. Soon after, he's released. The next day, Paul rushes to his wedding rehearsal dinner, and, as always, he's terribly late. He profusely apologizes to all the guests and then chats with them politely. Moments later, dinner is served, and everyone begins devouring the food. Paul, who was practically starving, relishes the dishes excitedly. However, it turns out that Jeff, the pharmacist whom Sandra had hired as the caterer for the rehearsal dinner, had mixed weed into every dish. As a result, the entire party gets incredibly high. Everyone loses their composure and starts giggling at anything and everything. Pete, who now has no control over his feelings, begins proposing a toast to Karen. But in the process, he ends up confessing his love for her, asserting that if he hadn't been married at the time, he would have chosen her as the woman of his dreams. As expected, the dinner becomes incredibly awkward, but Pete somehow changes the topic, and everyone goes back to being happy and chatty. After some time, whilst Pete, Paul, and Karen are engrossed in a conversation, Pete lets it slip that he still remembers the night he met Karen. In fact, he even remembers the song that was playing in the background. Karen simply giggles at this, but Paul feels really uncomfortable and suspicious. However, it turns out that even Karen remembers every single encounter that she's had with Pete. Paul then quietly observes Karen and Pete chatting and realizes that the two are practically the same person with the same views and interests. Now confused, he walks into the kitchen and asks his mom, Dorothy, why she chose Buck when he's clearly a little weird. In response, Dorothy smiles and explains that Buck lets her be herself and accepts her for who she is. Paul understands this and then looks at Becky, who happens to be dancing with Buck. That's when he realizes that she's the one for him. He thinks about how he can always be carefree and wild around her, and how she helps him become his best self. After the rehearsal dinner, Paul goes back to his apartment only to find Ray just lurking around. Not wanting to mess things up, he discreetly informs the internal affairs team about Ray's arrival, and then lures him into blurting out the truth. Ray, who has no idea about the wire on Paul's body, starts boasting about how he loves ruining people's lives. He then tells Paul about how he planted substances in his car to frame him. The internal affairs team gets this entire confession on record and bursts inside Paul's apartment. They then arrest him and drag him to jail. Finally, the day of the wedding arrives and all the guests immediately gather in the church. In the washroom, Pete helps Paul get ready and wishes him the best for his wedding. However, Paul begins hyperventilating and tells his brother everything that has happened so far. Now frustrated, he vents about having Becky in bed, going to incredible lengths to hide the truth from Karen. and having Ray actively try to sabotage his life. After a long while of ranting, Paul tries his best to calm down, but suddenly Ken walks out from one of the bathroom stalls. When Paul realizes that Ken heard everything, he freaks out even more and tries to clarify the situation. But much to his surprise, Ken simply brushes him off and asks him to move on since it's just a guy thing. Shortly after, Paul walks out of the bathroom and sees Becky sitting outside. Upon seeing him, Becky hands him his wedding present and congratulates him for starting a new chapter of his life. She then hesitantly walks away. Back in the main hall, everyone including Paul and Karen's parents settle down and excitedly wait for the bride and groom. Paul, along with Jim, his best man, gets ready at the altar and waits for Karen to walk down the aisle. At that moment, Pete walks up to Paul and informs him that their regular priest got sick at the rehearsal dinner, so Mr. Ferris will be taking his place to officiate the wedding. It's evident that Mr. Ferris hates Paul with a passion and doesn't want a sweet girl like Karen to marry him. Moments later, it's time for the bride to walk down the aisle. The music starts playing, and to everyone's shock, rock and roll songs fill the entire place. It turns out that Jim had asked the string quartet to play rock and roll music instead of the usual tunes. As expected, Karen is furious, but tries her best to stay calm. Not wanting to ruin her wedding, she walks down the aisle with Ken, glaring at Paul with nothing but anger in her eyes. When she finally reaches the altar, a visibly disgruntled Mr. Ferris proceeds with his speech. At one point, he asks the gathering if anyone objects to the union of Paul and Karen. Overwhelmed with guilt, Paul decides to come clean and announces to everyone present what he has gone through over the past couple of days. He then apologetically tells Karen that they're not right for each other and refuses to marry her. Pete immediately seizes the opportunity to express his true feelings for Karen. Struggling to stay on his feet, Pete tells Karen that he's been in love with her for years and regrets not meeting her sooner. He offers to take Paul's place and asks Karen to marry him. Karen readily agrees, and the two happily run out of the church. Realizing that he's now single, Paul looks over at a smiling Becky. With nothing holding him back anymore, he decides to take a chance with her and start fresh. As the guests begin to head home, Paul runs after Becky and calls out to her. Unfortunately, Becky doesn't hear him and gets into a cab. Paul, however, doesn't give up and keeps running after the car. Eventually, Becky notices him and immediately gets out of the cab. Paul rushes over to her and thanks her for giving him the strength to call off the wedding. He then confesses that he's in love with her and kisses her passionately. Becky kisses him back and tells him she really likes him too. The movie finally ends with the two driving away and starting a new chapter of their lives together.